If you're here, then you've probably watched this somewhat outdated video of mine called The Terrible State of Female Characters in Genshin, which, with the release of Fontaine, has aged kinda poorly. And I'm glad it did. I made that video purely out of the frustration that a lot of the female characters in Genshin just didn't live up to their potential in terms of writing. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the current state of female characters in Genshin Impact and how hoyoverse have drastically improved its writing, and also a few other things that I still think they could still work on. Just a disclaimer, I will only be talking about playable characters, mostly the 5 stars, and this is my personal opinion based on my experience in the fandom for the last 3 years. And I know a lot of the points I'm gonna make are also applicable to the male characters, but I'll be talking about them in my next video. Okay, first, before we get into all of the things that Hoyo did right and improved on, we're gonna talk about what made a lot of people, including myself, believe that Genshin just has terrible writing when it comes to its female characters. And no, I don't think it's insane to expect good writing and good characters from Genshin. I'm not expecting arcane levels of character writing here, okay? I just think that even in the early days, Genshin had a lot of solid materials to work with. So don't tell me to play some other game, because I love this game a lot, which is why it drives me insane when I see missed potentials. We've always known that Hoyo is capable of writing intriguing female characters, but somehow they just don't do it in Genshin. Now, the initial problem with Genshin's female characters, especially in the early days, can be divided into 3 parts. The first one is the sheer amount of female characters in the game. Now, this one isn't a problem that actually has any solution, because Genshin is a gacha game that needs to sell you these characters in order to earn a profit. And having a large roster will lead to a few characters feeling repetitive. This is obviously applicable to the characters regardless of their gender, and with how Genshin's roster is mostly female, it results in a lot of the female characters feeling a bit repetitive more than the male ones. Case in point, the overworked waifu trope. It doesn't help that this is also the most obvious in the early game, which is why I criticized it in my original video. We had 4 different characters that were essentially the same trope, even though they are very different characters lore-wise and even personality-wise. You could say that Jean, Ganyu, and Kokomi, and Keqing are all part of the overworked waifu tropes from the early days, but they are all actually very different from one another. It's just that hoyoverse tried to put all of them in a box, the overworked waifu box, so that it's easier to sell them as gacha characters. And it's a shortcut that they've taken more than once. And if we consider that their goal is to sell characters purely based on designs and easily digestible tropes, then we can understand the decision to reduce potentially intriguing and complex characters into simple tropes. There's simply too many characters overall, and it's just unrealistic to shine a light on a lot of these characters in order to make them stand out and flesh them out as well. I just expected that at least for the 5 stars that Hoyo are actively trying to sell, they should at least put a bit more effort into giving them depth and not take too many shortcuts. Which brings me to my second point, and that is the way Hoyo handled and showcased a lot of the female characters is pretty questionable, especially in the early days. And by that I mean the way they handled the execution of the characters' stories in the Archon quest. Mishandling a character's development in an Archon quest is the most apparent with A, and a lot of this is due to Inazuma's questionable pacing. The whole Archon quest was centered around her and her idea of eternity, yet we never really get a chance to see that vision of eternity established in the Archon quest itself. Instead, what we see is how A is being selfish and that her people are paying the price for it. What's interesting though is that we spend most of the Inazuma Archon quest with Yae Miko. The Archon quest in Inazuma more or less revolved around her and how she guides and manipulates the traveler throughout their time in Inazuma, which in my opinion makes Yae Miko stand out more compared to the actual Archon of Inazuma. But I get it, okay? Like, we're not supposed to see too much of A because her whole shtick is that she lives in isolation and is so out of touch with the people of Inazuma, which should be something that's addressed in her story quest, but we'll get to that. Jean was good in the Archon quest. She was there for most of it, and she plays a very important role too. She has lots of interactions with the Knights of Favonius and Venti, and there's even some teasing on her dynamic with several other characters. Overall, I think Hoyo did a good job in showing her off in the Archon quest. Ganyu was barely in the Archon quest except for the climax, and we didn't even see Hutao because she wasn't really relevant to the greater plot. But that's fine, right? Because we have story quests. Not like Hoyo can cram all of these 5 stars into the Archon quest, especially during the early days, they were only made up of 3 acts. And for the 4 stars, like, I get it, no one is expecting a 3-hour quest focusing on Bennett's backstory anytime soon, but we do have really good examples of 4 stars being memorable in the Archon quest. Like, for example, Ningguang and Beidou. These two are the 2 4 stars that I personally think got just the right amount of focus in the main story to make them feel actually like they're characters relevant to the story and humans living in Teyvat. Now, the last and biggest problems for most of the characters are actually the execution of the story quests. Obviously, this has gotten better over time, but especially in the earlier patch, specifically up until the early patches of Inazuma, it's in my opinion that a lot of the characters suffered from unfortunate story quests. While the story quests themselves aren't inherently that bad, Ayaka's and Yoimiya's first story quest aren't my personal favorites. I don't think Hoyo did them any favors by making both of their quests a requirement to progress with the Archon quest, which in my personal opinion messes up the already weak pacing of Inazuma. I revisited both of their quests while writing the script for this video, and the main problem that I have with Yoimiya's first quest is how, while it showcased a lot of great things about Yoimiya, that being she's kind, compassionate, and her wholesome dynamic with her father, the majority of the quest is focused on solving an NPC's problem. I do think the purpose of Yoimiya's quest is to further establish just how much the Sakoku Decree and the Civil War has affected the lives of regular Inazuman citizens, with the way it has torn apart friendships and showing how even the soldiers of the Tenryo commissions themselves are actually reluctant about the whole thing. And I think another thing that they were trying to show with Yoimiya's quest was a different perspective on A's eternity. And I have seen some people argue that this is why they needed to insert her quest before progressing the main plot, which is still something I disagree with. I just think they made Yoimiya's quest mandatory because after part 2 of the Archon quest, the traveler becomes a wanted criminal in Inazuma, and it would have made no sense for them to go around the city anymore. This is a problem that stems from how Hoyo decided to cram everything that's happening into 3 acts, at least in the early days. If we had gotten more time, it's a lot easier to establish both the world and the characters without making it feel out of place. And this is something they've learned to do much better in more recent times with a very specific character, but we'll get into that. But before that, we need to talk about Ayaka. Okay, so Ayaka's story quest, I don't know, this is again a personal opinion. After revisiting it, I do agree it should have been a good story quest. I mean, on paper, it had everything that one would want from a story quest. We spent a lot of time with Ayaka. The quest itself is about her and her mother. We learn a lot of new things about her as a character. So then why does her quest get dismissed as a dating sim and nothing else? I mean, sure, it has its flaws, but it's in concept a good quest. Now again, my opinion, I think the whole thing fell apart when Hoyo decided to make the traveler more important to Ayaka than they actually are. Yes, I understand that Ayaka's fascination towards the traveler is completely justified with how they represent the outside world, a world that Ayaka is unfamiliar with. It's only natural that she's intrigued. But I just cannot for the life of me buy that the traveler is Ayaka's only friend. It makes no sense to push a narrative that Ayaka has no friends when Toma is literally right there. Do you mean to tell me that she considers Toma nothing more than her staff? This is even more inconsistent considering she was willing to risk it all for Toma literally in the Archon quest right after her own story quest. So she has emotional connections to the people in her life. It's not like she's completely isolated. But I do agree that she is held to a different standard as a noblewoman in Inazuma, and that poses a real challenge for her to overcome as a person. But the friendship and the connection that she has with the traveler just feels so forced, and we do get to see her overcome it with the way she decided to go to a festival despite knowing the attention it might bring, only for Hoyo to double down on the pandering to the traveler by adding another layer of unnecessary romantic subtext. Now obviously it's completely up to you whether or not you want to interpret Ayaka's and the traveler's interactions as romantic or platonic, but I personally think they added romantic subtext with the additions of scenes like these. It's unnecessary pandering towards the players, which is why a lot of people just cannot look past the dating sim aspect of her quest. And yes, Plus, I think the placement of her quest also breaks the pacing of Inazuma's story overall. I personally think that Ayaka's story quest would have been much better had it been optional, or if it took place literally any other time than between two very important and high-stakes Archon quests. It also doesn't really help that the times Ayaka appear afterwards and like in events is either her dumping expositions or doubling down on the pandering to the players in order to sell her latest skin. It really doesn't help her traveler simp reputation. However, there is a character that I truly do believe doesn't have any emotional connections apart from the traveler, and that character is Shenhe. At least in the beginning, I know Shenhe's made friends now. We know she has connections with Cloud Retainer and she knows a thing or two about the other Adepti in Liyue, but the fascination that she has for the traveler is, in my opinion, a lot more believable. Shenhe lives in isolation. She's violent and doesn't understand society or man-made laws. She doesn't even eat normal human food. She eats medicinal herbs, which is why people mistake her for an Adeptus, including the Traveler and Paimon. Now, A's first story quest is also a big reason why I think a lot of the players don't like her writing or are still under the impression that her story quest is a full-on date that served no other purpose but to add more fan service for the new shiny Archon. It also didn't help that there was no buffer time between the end of the Inazuma Archon quest and A's first story quest, which made it seem that the Traveler was all buddy-buddy with her after the Shogun puppet tried to murder them the entire time they were in Inazuma, and literally just days prior. Ganyu's story quest just exacerbates on how Hoyo decided to not show the most interesting part of her lore, which is an opinion that I still think is true even until now. I'm hoping that we can see more of her Adeptus side and her dynamics with Kaching, who, if you didn't know, is someone who she often clashes with because of their differing beliefs. See, Ganyu being a devout follower of Rex Lapis and Kaching is the exact opposite. Please, literally, I'm begging Hoyoverse to show more sides of Ganyu now that a certain someone is gonna be playable. Hu Tao's story quest itself is still enjoyable. I revisited the quest recently and I enjoyed it a lot more now that I didn't dive into it right after doing all of the NPC fetch quests of the first Lantern Rite. But I do think the focus was still too much on the NPCs involved and it wasn't on Hu Tao herself. We know she has an interesting backstory and lore, but it's just not showcased enough, especially in the early days. I have an entire video on Hu Tao here if you want my full opinion on her story quest. But in short, I just think it would have been nice to have a quest about Hu Tao, focusing on Hu Tao instead of Meng and Big G. We basically learned nothing new about Hu Tao in general. We just learned a few things about the Wangsheng funeral parlor and her role as the director, but nothing that adds or develops Hu Tao as a character. Kokomi is probably the most unfortunate example of the initial problems that plagues the early writing of Genshin. She has the potential. She's sold as this genius strategist with interesting lore related to an entire island's history in Inazuma. And yet they did her so dirty in the Archon quest and in her own story quest. For someone who's supposed to be a powerful figure, she basically had no agency in the war or even on Watatsumi Island. Hoyo gave her one moment to shine, which was her initial introduction, and then everything went downhill from there. Her story quest isn't much different. It had an interesting premise with how tough it is to deal with the after effects of war and how it can be challenging to maintain the peace that was so hard earned, and also the toll that all of that takes on Kokomi as a person. And yet, the way Hoyo chose to present her story quest is her taking a lot of naps and making the traveler read her to sleep, which is a cute moment. It can be cute, but we've already gotten the overworked I need a break storyline multiple times at this point. Yelan has an interesting lore that we unfortunately never get to see even until now. One of her best moments as a character, in my opinion, was during the interlude quest, which was mainly focused around Xiao and the Yakshas. But seeing her clash with Xiao multiple times because of how different they are is one of the things that stood out to me in the interlude quest. And three other characters that I think are mostly fine and have had a lot of time on screen are Yae Miko, Eula, and Shenhe. Yae Miko just has a very distinct personality that isn't for everybody. She's not the nicest, which is usually the main thing that people dislike about her. But she does live up to her kitsune trope, and I think she's fun. At least she stands out from the rest of the cast. Eula's story quest was actually one of the better ones, especially in the early days. We have an NPC at the center of it, but it's literally her uncle. It's unique to her, and we get to learn a lot of things about Eula as a character. We get to see how harshly she's treated despite never doing anything wrong herself. We know Eula is inherently a good person, yet she gets so much crap for being a Lawrence. She never did any of her family's crimes herself, but she sure is paying for it. And no matter what she does for Mondstadt, people just can't look past the fact that she's a Lawrence. And it sucks. You feel bad for her, so when you see her uncle going around and trying to start shit again, you can't help but want to stop this nonsense. And at the end of it, we get to see Eula arrest her own uncle, which, knowing how terrible her uncle was, it should be a good thing, right, that he got arrested. But I think it's still hard for Eula to arrest a family member like that. I think it was a good character moment. It doubles down on how good she is at heart despite all of the unfair crap that's thrown at her. Even in the early days, it's not all that bad though. We have what I believe to be notable exceptions, which I did also mention in my initial video. The exceptions to the questionable writing of characters in Genshin are actually the female 4-star characters. Ningguang is definitely one of my favorites early on. I think she established herself really well as a leader in Liyue. She's not an Archon or anything, but in the limited time she was on screen, Hoyo made sure the players knew that she was top dog in the cheesing and she had the final say in defeating Osayo. She even gets this great moment where she decided to sacrifice the Jade Chamber, which, if you don't know, has been established a symbol of her wealth. And if you've read Ningguang's character story, you would know that she wasn't born rich. She has a rags to riches story, which made the whole thing even more impactful narratively. She as a character has agency and was in complete control of the situation, which is pretty cool. She isn't the main character of the quest by any means, but Hoyo was able to make her live up to her potential. Same with Beidou. She wasn't really in the Liyue Archon quest, but she had a lot of impactful and memorable moments in the Inazuma Archon quest, even though she's a 4-star character from Liyue. Beidou is the person that helps the traveler get to Inazuma in the first place. She helps the resistance in the fight against Kujo-Sara alongside Kazuha. She lives up to the badass pirate that we were told she was. Fischl, the unique character that she is, actually has a lot more depth than a lot of the 5-star characters really early on. But to be fair, most of it is in limited time events. She has an entire character arc in these events. She also develops a really sweet friendship with Mona in the Unreconciled Stars event, and I like that they continued this friendship even much later on. Now outside of that, we also have other interesting 4-star female characters with a lot of potential, like for example Kuki Shinobu and Rosaria, but none of them are actually shown in any of the main quests or even in events that much. Most of the information about them can be obtained through either hangouts or hidden behind a wall of text in their character story, which is fine if you're a fan of Kuki Shinobu and maybe like Noelle and maybe even Diona for whatever reason. They get pretty solid hangouts that reveal a lot of things about them as standalone characters. Okay, so now that we've established a lot of the initial problems with the writing in Genshin, as well as also the things that they did right, what did Hoyo do to make it better? Why do people now go into Fontaine and they can say, hey, that's good writing? What even is good character writing? This is just my personal opinion, but good character writing is one where a character has lived up to its full potential. 2, when they have layers and have nuance to their actions. And 3, they're given enough time to develop. And by that I mean to develop either to their potential or have enough time to establish them and their already pre-written lore, making us, the audience, understand them better and thus giving them layers and nuance to their actions. And I think Hoyo in the more recent years have done just that. They, for the most part, just let the characters shine on their own by giving them room to have more interactions with one another and just more time to be fleshed out. This starts being apparent in Sumeru, with Nahida and Dihya being the two that stand out the most to me, at least for the 5 stars. There's a very specific 4-star that stood out, but we'll get to her. Nahida, being the Archon of Wisdom, acted the way we expect her to act. She guides the traveler the best she can while she's being held hostage. She's also shown to be very benevolent and forgiving and one of the kindest characters in the game. It's a bit unfair to compare her to A, especially when A acted as the main antagonist for Inazuma and her main struggle was her not being able to deal with grief and the loss of her twin sister, while Nahida's struggle was more about her being literally one held captive and later on feeling incapable of being an Archon and filling the role of Rukadevata. But I think Nahida was great overall, especially especially in executions, because we get to see moments where she's empathetic and she shows a great deal of love for her people despite how they've been treating her for hundreds of years. We also see her benevolence and wisdom through interactions with other characters, specifically the Wanderer. Nahida was the first person to give the Wanderer a chance after his defeat. She was the one who saw the person that he could be underneath all of that anger and resentment. Dihya is also one of those characters that is just pleasant to be around ever since her initial appearance. Now, I made the mistake of not including her in my initial video because when I wrote the script for that video, her story quest wasn't out yet, and then it took me a million years to edit that video, so basically I forgot, and yes, it was my bad for not including her. Definitely my bad, because Dihya's story quest is a really good example of turning a solid side character into a memorable and great character. I think Dihya's story quest in general is what I hope every character story quest would be. It doesn't need to be this massive lore-changing story quest like Zhongli and A's story quest, but the story quest itself was about Dihya. If you don't remember what her story quest is about, it's a story that explores Dihya's relationship with her father Kusela and her life as an eremite. It's also something that we never could have gotten in the Sumero Archon quest with 15 different things already going on at the same time, which is why a character story quest is the perfect time to showcase things that we wouldn't get to see otherwise, which includes a character's pre-established lore or even an expansion of said lore. The NPC that are present in the quest adds a lot to Dihya instead of shifting the focus away from her. She was also allowed to show a lot of emotions and have an entire character arc about her relationship with her father in that one quest. Really, when I say I want a character story quest to be about them and not NPCs, this is what I mean. I will talk about Dihya in more detail later on, but before that, Hoyo has also improved a lot of the female characters' writing through their second story quest. I'm gonna start with Yoimiya. Now, initially, I always found Yoimiya to be an alright character. She's cute and kind and she's great to be around, but her first story quest was just not the strongest in terms of writing. Her second story quest, however, is a completely different experience. First, you can basically play the quest whenever you want, and it surprisingly adds a lot to Yoimiya as a character. This quest also changed my mind about her quite a lot. In my initial video, I grouped her together as the nice girl waifu, which can be boring to some people. And while I've never said that we're not allowed to have nice girls or that they're automatically boring for not having extensive lore, my issue with Yoimiya and the other characters that I've lumped into that category has always been the lack of screen time in the story. In fact, I think it's nice that we have a well-adjusted normal human being in the 5-star roster for once. I think it's great that she's compassionate to complete strangers. She's a good role model. She doesn't just have a dad, but she also has a mom. Imagine that, a character with a healthy relationship with both of her parents, and she's also really well liked by her community. I personally think the whole point of her character is to be as ordinary as one can be, which isn't a bad thing, but the execution of her story quest really made her extraordinary. At first glance, her story quest should feel like another date quest or a quest that focuses way too much on a random NPC, yet it doesn't. Why is that? Well, in my opinion, it's because the date sequence in the quest is not there to sell you on how cute she is as a character, because it doesn't pander to the traveler, and the NPC is there to be a convenient plot device that somehow ends up being the focus of the entire quest. They're both there with the intention of developing Yoimiya as a character. Yoimiya goes to Sumeru with the intention of gathering information of a legendary meteor shower that's been passed on in her family for generations. The desire to recreate this meteor shower was what started the Nagonohara fireworks in the first place. So as someone who's very passionate in her craft, it's very believable and natural that Yoimiya would want to find inspiration the same way her ancestors did. Avin, the NPC, also serves a similar purpose. She's there to highlight Yoimiya's kindness and compassion compassion, which is her best trait. The same way Tuser was there to develop Child as a character by showing us the players that Child actually has a compassionate side in his story quest. Yoimiya is shown to be someone who's really positive, and she is just so damn likable that you probably couldn't help but want to help her see the meteor shower even if you don't really care about her that much in the first place. The quest also sold Yoimiya's positive personality without making it seem fake or over the top. Yoimiya as a person is always positive and always tries to see the good in things because she's never really let go of that childlike wonder. Even the Aranara points out how Yoimiya hasn't really grown up. Now, this isn't saying that she's immature or childish, quite the opposite actually. It means that Yoimiya is able to dream and look at life the same way that a lot of children do. Like, she has a very positive attitude about a lot of different things. She's just not jaded like most adults are. A lot of adults would think that indulging in children's dreams and fantasies is silly because, well, they're just that, fantasies, they're not real. But Yoimiya recognizes the importance of having that childlike glee and wonder when looking at life. And Yoimiya isn't gullible. She knows the world can be a nasty place. Her home country was at war for quite a while, so she's not ignorant to the darker sides of life. But as shown at how she was determined to help Avin, Yoimiya recognizes the importance of having a dream and holding on to that dream even in a hopeless situation. With the addition of that story quest, Yoimiya went from a character that's cute and nice to basically a character that you wish were real because you probably want someone like her as your friend in real life. It only took 1 hour of a well-written story quest to add so many layers to Yoimiya as a character, and she is finally living up to her potential. Next up is Raiden Shogun, or A. Now, it's impossible to talk about the saving grace of a second story quest without talking about Raiden Shogun, or A. Her second story quest is what a lot of people consider to be how Hoyo redeemed her writing. Aside from the massive lore bombs, I think what made her second story quest shine was the fact that they let her have an entire character arc in that quest. It's an excellent way to show A finally having some agency and control as a character and as an archon, especially when it comes to changing her ideology and just overall outlook on eternity. It also helps that she's forced to go against the very thing that she's created, so to an extent she is finally being held accountable for her own actions. She now has to defeat the very idea of eternity that she's held on for so long in the form of the Shogun puppet. And I know a lot of people still take issue with A not being punished for essentially letting a civil war happen in Inazuma. She's not responsible for it, but she did let it happen. But in her story quest, she fought the Shogun puppet for 500 years. It's the same amount of time that she locked herself inside the plane of euthymia, and with her showing so much determination, she was finally able to convince the damn puppet that she was indeed growing as a person. The change in her ideology is the mark of character growth. It's also, I think, the best way for Hoyo to hold A accountable for her actions in the Archon quest, because it's pretty impossible and wouldn't make a lot of sense if she was punished because she is the god of that nation. It's also very emotional with the appearance of Makoto, and really just showing a character dynamic and having them show emotions is always a good thing in my opinion. That quest also has really good immersive mechanics, which is always a plus. The only other female character with a second story quest is Nahida. Now before that, Nahida's first story quest is pretty good. I personally enjoyed it. It's very on theme for her, with it being about dreams and all. If you don't remember what the quest is about, the Traveler and Paimon were approached by this group of people who get together to dream. Nahida destroyed the Akasha terminal at the end of the Archon quest, which stopped everyone from having their dreams harvested, so now adults are dreaming for the first time ever. This sequence of events has led to the gathering of people in an event called A Moment of Dreams, where people gather to talk about, well, their dreams. And in this gathering, they come across Ilman, someone who's been having continuous dreams about his deceased wife, which Nahida notes as something that's extremely uncommon. We soon come to find out that this isn't an isolated incident and that someone is purposely exploiting people's desires to escape reality and also as a coping mechanism to deal with grief, which obviously isn't very healthy, as Nahida mentioned at the start of the quest. By refusing to let go of the past and choosing dreams over reality will only make it harder for people to move on with their lives. And not to mention, going back to these dreams are actually dangerous, and yeah, I like the premise. I like that the story has one central theme, and that is dealing with dreams and grief. It also places Nahida, who is the god of wisdom, in the middle, where we get to see her guide her people. Overall, it's a good quest. I think it's on par with a lot of the other Sumeru quests we've gotten. Her second story quest, I have similar opinions, with the addition of it being a lot more interesting purely because of the massive lore bomb that we got with a pep. Nahida's second story quest starts with the traveler and Nahida bumping into an elemental being in the form of a fungus trying to look for its home. That home later on is revealed to be a pep, the Dendro Dragon, the first ever dragon sovereign that we've met in the game, mind you. It's definitely one of the more lore-focused story quests, which is always a treat in my opinion, especially when it comes to lore related to the focus character. One of the biggest differences that it has with a second story quest is how there's not really much development for Nahida as a character, but in this case it's not really a problem since we've already gotten a lot of development for Nahida in the Archon quest itself. This quest is a nice addition and expansion of her lore, and also to how she, as a relatively new Archon, is learning about the world and its secrets alongside the traveler. But I think one of the best story quests in Sumeru is Dihia's. Yes, I know it doesn't have any importance to the lore, but it just does everything right. It's a very personal quest. It explores the dynamics of the Eremites, which is a group that she is a part of, and one of the most defining traits of her as a character. It's also very unique to Dihia because she is the only playable Eremite character that we have, at least as of right now. It touches on her estranged relationship with her dad, which was already teased in her character story. And overall, it is a journey of Dihia discovering the truth about her father, the sacrifices that he made to ensure that she was able to get out of the rough lifestyle of being an Eremite, and overall, just him wanting her to have a better life. We get to see a lot of different sides to Dihia. I mean, we've seen a lot of her in the Archon quest. We already know that she's dependable, kind, and strong, but we just get another layer of her in the story quest. We see her struggling and grieving as she learns the truth about Kusela. Dihia grew up believing that she has a deadbeat dad, but now she has to come to terms with the fact that everything her dad did was in fact for her. He wanted her to have a better life. He wanted Dihia as far away as possible from the life of an Eremite. He did everything he could for her, even until his very last breath. And you just feel so much for Dihia because now we know that she will never get that moment of reconciliation with her misunderstood father because she's just too little too late, but also at the same time you can't really blame her because her father never really intended for her to find out anyway. There's just a lot of raw emotions in that quest. And the best part of it is that we get to witness a lot of it, like almost every moment of it actually. None of it was just offhandedly mentioned or dumped in a conversation at the end of the quest, which is again what made her story quest stand out from the rest. Another story quest that we got in Sumeru but unfortunately is not as good is Nilu's. And this isn't because Nilu doesn't have an interesting backstory, because I personally think she does. She represents the creatives and the artists that's often looked down upon in a very academic driven society. She is one of the few people in Sumeru that just goes against the status quo, and you would think that Nilu's story quest would be the perfect time for Hoyo to showcase the hardships that she might have had during her life, with how a lot of people just looks down on her for not being a scholar. And while we do get something similar to that, it just baffles me that Hoyo did this with another character that's not even playable. Yes, the values that Inaya represents is in a way the same as Nilu's, so then why the hell not just make it about Nilu? You know, the character that we're actually here for. We didn't learn anything about Nilu or the theater after the quest. We knew that Nilu is brave and kind, but we already know those things from the Archon quest. The debate that she has with the scholar at the end would have been more interesting had the entire quest's focus was on her instead of an NPC that we will never see again. Well, yes, Nilu is one of the ordinary female characters and she doesn't have a lot of crazy lore to back her up. Her whole shtick is that she's a good dancer and she's nice, and that's fine because when done right, ordinary characters can be one of the most endearing and interesting in their own way. Case in point, again, Yoimiya. Ordinary characters can be interesting, they just suffer from bad NPC story quests. It feels like hoyoverse isn't confident that they can be interesting on their own, so they have to introduce random person number 626 to have a decent story, which is bizarre considering how people people are spending money on a lot of these characters and they already have pre-written lore anyway, so it's not like they have to make shit up on the spot. There needs to be a balance at just how much the presence of an NPC is helping us, the players, in getting to know the 5-star character, instead of it being the other way around. I don't need to know stuff about the NPC if it doesn't add to the 5-star character. Learning about a character's hopes and dreams and why they do the things that they do shape compelling narratives, which is why it's so important for Hoyo to show all of these on screen. And in the moments that they do, it creates a meaningful and emotional storytelling. Now, despite my criticism of Nilu's story quests, the female characters in Sumeru are a major improvement. The 4-star female characters in Sumeru don't really outshine the 5 stars like in the early days. I still think the 4 stars hold up pretty well. Candace was great in the Archon quest. Both Faruzan and Layla are fun in events. Dory is, well, Dory. But the 4-star that stands out the most, for me at least, has to be Collei. Collei has always been an important character since before Genshin even came out. She has lore that goes far beyond the main quest. She's already linked to Tighnari and Sino, both very pivotal characters in the Sumeru Archon quest. But she's also linked to Dottore. She has a whole backstory established in the webtoon, and she even has a really big personality change during the time gap between the webtoon and the game. It's just a bit of a shame that they never really dove deep into Collei's time in Mondstadt or development in the game. Most, if not all of it, happens off screen. By the time we meet her in Sumeru, she's a lot more positive than she was in the webtoon. When she first stumbled into Mondstadt after escaping from the clutches of Dottore, Collei was extremely jaded. She's been treated horribly by the people around her because she wasn't really the strongest physically, and this caused her to be extremely distrusting of both people and gods. We only see glimpses of her past trauma a few times, but I like how Hoyo showed this on screen. She screams at Paimon for touching her without her consent. And through that moment, I think a lot of players realized just how fucked up Collei's situation is. Like, she has been through shit. As we saw for ourselves, just a simple innocent touch from Paimon is enough to get such an extreme reaction from her. At the end of the webtoon, Collei follows Sino to Sumeru to learn more about the world, which is how she ended up in Sumeru, and then the traveler goes to Sumeru and she is the first person that we meet after Hypatia. Sino bringing Collei to Sumeru is also the start of one of the most wholesome dynamics in the game. With the release of Sumeru in the game, we also get to see Collei have different relationship dynamics with 2 other very important characters, that of course being Tighnari and Sino. The 3 of them have a very loving and healthy relationship. Tighnari acts like a pseudo guardian to her, and despite him being strict and sometimes sassy, Collei knows that he has a good heart. Her dynamic with Sino is also one of the most interesting ones in the games. If you look at Collei's voice lines and how she talks to him, it's easy to get the impression that she's uncomfortable with him. She doesn't think that he's a bad person or is scary, like 90% of the people in Sumeru are terrified of Sino, but Collei is uncomfortable around him for a completely different reason. Sino is the person that brought Collei to Sumeru. He was the one who helped her during her time in Mondstadt by sealing the Archon residue that was left inside her body by Dottore. Sino is the one who asked for Tighnari's help in taking care of Collei. Collei is also able to recognize that Sino is a good person, yet that doesn't erase the trauma that she has from the events that she went through in Mondstadt. But from the events and snippets we've gotten over the last year, it does seem like the relationship is improving, especially with the effort that both of them are making. I personally love Collei as a character. She feels like a real person that you will meet in the world of Teyvat. She doesn't feel like another character to add to the roster just for the sake of it. And even without showing the details of the webtoon within the game itself, I think Hoyo did a good job in setting her up as a character. We have an entire plotline set up at the start of the Archon quest. We have a resolution to that setup. By the end of it, she gets cured from Elazar. She also has different relationships with various different characters, all of which are shown on screen, and all of that are foundations of a believable and good character. So it's pretty safe to say that the Fontaine cast has a lot of well-written characters, but two women in particular stand out from the rest. Those two being Navia and Furina, both of whom we actually spent a lot of time with in the Archon quest. Navia is the one that surprised me the most. Honestly, it's impressive just how much Hoyo was able to develop her character on screen. She started out fine. She approached the traveler asking for collaboration and help in investigating the serial disappearances case, which has been established as early as we arrived in Fontaine. She introduced herself as the boss of Spina di Rosula. She also introduced Melus and Silver. And from the get-go, we know that Navia has a goal. She wanted to find the truth behind her father's death. The traveler wanted to clear Linny's name from Furina's accusations, so it's only natural that they joined forces. Navia added so much to the Fontaine Archon quest. You could even say that she was the heart of it. Linny would have been in the fortress of Meropide for murder if it wasn't for her. And because we learned about why she was so determined to uncover the truth and why it's so personal to her, it makes for a compelling narrative. Especially when we get to see her be in the same room as the people who let her father die and the one who literally killed her father. This scene with Neuvillette wasn't emotional because Navia was crying. It was emotionally impactful because we know how frustrated Navia was in that moment, to the point that it drove her to tears. She is still grieving, and yet she feels like she needs to uncover the truth by herself. And as far as she's concerned, people like Chlorine and Neuvillette did nothing and will continue to do nothing. Considering how 2 out of the 5 acts of the Fontaine Archon quest were centered around Navia, the traveler has spent a lot of time with her during their time in Fontaine. It makes her bond with the traveler a lot more believable. They did so much together, so the trust that she gives to the traveler by the time we get to her story quest is believable. It never really felt like Navia trusted the traveler for no reason or just because they're the main character. It doesn't feel like it's unnecessary pandering towards the main character of the story because it feels like we've earned her trust. Giving her traits like compassion and ambition while also directly showing scenes where she's emotional and struggling made her feel like a real human being. The Fontaine Archon quest also did a great job in giving both Navia and Furina sufficient amount of time to have entire character arcs within those 5 acts. I don't think the pacing was all over the place at all. It felt fine because the story revolved around one central theme, and that being the prophecy. All of the Fontaine characters, Furina and Navia especially, had major links to the prophecy. And I think that link between the characters and the prophecy was set up early on and in a pretty effective manner. The more that we learn about Navia and later on Furina, it felt like we were also learning more and more about the main story. It never really felt like we were going off track and somehow got roped into a weird side quest in the middle of an intense storyline. Using Navia as an example, we meet her because she has her own motives. She wants to uncover the truth about her father. And as fate would have it, the downfall of Navia's father, Callus, is directly related to Marcel, aka Vacher, the person responsible for the serial murders that Charlotte brought up at the very beginning of the Fontaine Archon quest. The disappearances or murders also revealed the true nature of the primordial seawater, which is heavily correlated to the prophecy and Egeria's original sin. The whole thing with Callus also explains the dynamic between Navia, Chlorine, and Neuvillette. Even without the traveler, Navia already exists as a person in Fontaine. And this is the case for a lot of the Fontaine characters. They're just able to stand on their own. They have believable relationships with one another, like Linny and Lynette. Lynette especially, even though Linny is the 5-star of the pair, the Archon quest never treated Lynette as the side character, at least in my opinion. Yes, she's the assistant and Linny is the main man of the magic act, but we get a backstory on why she's so reserved and why she's mostly in the background while Linny takes center stage. And a lot of Linny's motivations come from his desire to protect his siblings. Lynette especially because 1, they're twins, and 2, Lynette's been through one of the most horrific things one could have imagined at a really young age. Lynette, even while she barely ever speaks and is mostly in the background to her more charismatic brother, she feels real. She feels like a real person you'd meet in Fontaine with her own set of goals, motivations, hardships, all that good stuff. I've already done a full analysis of Furina as a character and her writing, but to quickly recap, I think that Hoyo did a really great job with making one of the most human characters in the game. I think none of us ever expected an Archon to be so human and relatable. Similar to Navia, I think Hoyo did a great job in setting up Furina as a character. Hoyo was able to set up Furina as a mystery and later on subverted players' expectation when the truth was revealed. While I'm not the biggest fan of the way they did, there's actually two of them for an Archon storyline again, just with a different twist every time. I still think it's mostly fine. Hoyo managed to accomplish what they wanted to do, and that is to make Furina a believable human character and to tell a compelling story about the Hydro Archon. Both Navia and Furina's story quests were also good. They weren't my personal favorites, but they did add interesting stuff about the characters themselves. In Furina's story quest, she goes back on stage and receives a vision as a form of recognition and most probably gratitude for all of her sacrifices that she's made for Fontaine. While for Navia, it expanded a bit more into her father and family outside of the Marcel case. We now know a lot more about her family and the history of the Spina di Rosula, and it's fun. It's fun to see Navia say that she's partners with the Traveler. I think that title is well earned after everything that we've been through together with her in the Archon quest. In contrast with how they tried to set up Ayaka's friendship with the Traveler, Navia's bond with the Traveler is just a lot more believable. Both Navia and Furina are good examples of how Hoyo managed to give them enough nuance that it makes both of them feel authentic and relatable and just feel like a real character and a real human being. And that's because they showcased a lot of things about their past, what they're suffering through and how they're dealing with their suffering and how they cope with it, which are all the right ingredients for a compelling character story. Heck, those things are front and center in the Archon quest itself. We didn't even need to wait for the story quest, which is why it's so easy for players to feel connected to the Fontaine characters and why they just feel like they're better written. I don't really have an issue with the 4 stars in Fontaine as well. I think the ones that are released, such as Charlotte, Lynette, and most recently Chevreuse, have been pretty good. Their presence makes the world of Fontaine feel a lot more live. Like having Charlotte popping up in random places because she's trying to get a scoop is fun. It makes sense because she's a journalist and that's what she usually does anyway. And with the recent event, I ended up liking Chevreuse more than I thought I would. She's shown to be a very badass character. We even get a glimpse into her backstory and why she's the perfect person to lead the special forces of the guards. She's shown to have a lot of street smarts considering where she came from. She also has a very peculiar, borderline abusive father, and I like that despite her troubled upbringing, Chevreuse still managed to be a good person. Which brings me to the question, why are there no events centered around the 5-star female characters? Aside from Lee, of course. So we've already established that a big chunk of what makes the characters in Genshin feel a bit stale in writing at times is the NPC-centered quests and just the lack of screen time, which translates to not enough time for them to be developed. Now yes, the complaints I just said can be applicable to the male characters as well, but somehow the male characters, some of them have been the focus of one of the most memorable events in Genshin's history. I mean it when I say, like, if not for the 2.3 Dragon Spine event, most of us would have probably forgotten Albedo by now, especially with how forgettable his story quest was. I shit you not, I thought the first Dragon Spine event back in 1.2 was his story quest. We get most of his lore from the Dragon Spine events, which looking back, I think they just ran out of Albedo lore that's not related to Kandria, and that's why we haven't gotten any more Dragon Spine events in the last 2 years. But anyway, tangent aside, now don't get me wrong, we have gotten female characters featured in events before, like Mona and Fischl and most recently Chevreuse, and we have gotten a good chunk of development and even backstory through those quests, which is why I'm genuinely curious why there's still so few events focusing on the female 5-star characters. And I don't mean as a group, like I genuinely want to see a female character being featured in an event the same way Albedo was. I have one character in mind that I really want to see featured in an event because I personally think she is the literal walking definition of a missed potential, and yes, I'm talking about Kokomi. And before you say anything, yes, I know she's been featured in events before, but the events were really about her. We never learned anything new about her either. I would also lump Gunyu into the characters I want to see getting an exclusive event. We've had multiple lantern rides and multiple events in Liyue, and even one with Kaching as the main character, yet we've never really seen more of Ganyu outside of her conversations with Cloud Retainer. And even Kaching, there's so many interesting things about Kaching. Kaching has an entire arc about her beliefs and Rex Lapis in her character story, and yet in the one event that she was featured in as the main character, Hoyo decided to focus on her working too much, as if we haven't gotten that before. An event doesn't always have to be too serious, like it can also be fun. Like I'm sure a lot of us enjoyed the annual Klee summer event. Like I'm not gonna complain about having a feel-good event centered around one of the most adorable characters in the game. What I'm trying to say is that why can't we get an event similar to the 2.3 Albedo event for the more lore-heavy female characters? Or characters like Ganyu, who has a lot more lore behind her, like she partook in a literal ancient war. Focusing on the more boring side of her, like how she's overworked, again, will just make her seem like she's a boring character when she's not. And if we can't have that in a permanent story quest, at least let us have it in a limited time event. These events can be memorable for showing different sides of a character and also showing different character dynamics. For example, I think the first Klee event was memorable not only because of how fun it was, but also because it showcased really fun sibling dynamics. Like we have Albedo and Klee, Kea and Diluc, and of course Jean and Barbara. Now the focus wasn't entirely on Jean and Barbara, but at least we got to see them interact. We now know a bit more about Jean and Barbara's relationship through the event. We've always known that they're sisters and that they grew apart ever since their parents' divorce, but seeing how they still care for one another despite everything is nice. It's just nice to be able to see the relationships that these characters have and not having to rely on voice lines or various walls of text to know more about them. I think Mona, Fischl, and Xinyan are again the best examples of female characters that's gotten most of their development in limited time events. Like we've obviously gotten a lot of character appearances in events, but these three in particular got a lot of their motivations, goals, backstory, and even relationships showcased in an event. We finally get to see why Mona is so broke and her feelings towards practicing astrology, and how it can be challenging for her emotionally and mentally. She can see the future and yet she can't do anything about it or change it, and we also get to see her come to terms with it. Fischl, she has an entire character arc about how she came to terms that she is both Amy and Fischl in the Golden Apple Archipelago event. In fact, I think the first time Fischl has ever broken character was also in an event, which was the Unreconciled Stars event. Same event where she met Mona for the first time. I feel like Hoyo can develop a lot of their characters through events if they wanted to, but considering how they're still time limited, a lot of players would probably miss out on it. I just wish there was a way for newer players to experience past events. I don't know, they could have it stored somewhere and not give the same rewards or any rewards. Just let the newer players have an option to experience the event quests, especially the ones that add so much to the lore and character development. Gacha games are usually full of tropes, right? And I've complained about them. Hoyo does them, but how can Hoyo avoid the more tropey waifus? And yes, despite my criticism, I personally think that Hoyo has done a good job in the concept of a good female character. Dihya is a good example. She's part of the Eremites, a group known to be violent and mostly known to be mercenaries. Dihya is a mercenary herself, and she is tough, like she is undoubtedly physically strong, but she is also shown to have a lot of feminine interests. She is canonically beautiful, and in her own character story, she tells us she recognizes the importance in grooming and keeping her hygiene in check. She also has a lot of interest in makeup, something that not a lot of the tough warrior woman trope would usually go for. And she's also feminine in a way that she's kind and compassionate to the people she cares about. Overall, Dihya feels like a believable person, which is why she doesn't feel like a trope. Honestly, I'm sure if you've consumed any kind of modern media, then you are no stranger to the efforts that different companies have made to make a strong female character. And I want to give credit where credit is due. I mean, yes, Genshin is a gacha game and there will always be fan service, but despite the flaws in execution, Hoyo has always had a good grasp on what a strong and complex female character is like. Despite my criticism of how there's just a lot of missed potentials and overused tropes, I still think Hoyo offers a lot of female characters in Genshin, at least in concept. From every region, we have a really wide variety of women in power. In Mondstadt, we have Jean, who is the second in command to Varka, and while he's off God knows where, she's the one left in charge. We also have Eula, a captain of the Knights of Avonius, someone who you would consider strong, yes, and she is. She's very strong, but Eula also has a lot going for her. Being from a noble family, she also knows how to dance, and she isn't exactly afraid to speak her mind and go against said family. We also have Mona, someone who is arguably one of the most passionate and ambitious people in Teyvat. Like, yes, she has one of the most fan servicey design out of the female roster, but she also has the personality that make her a great character in my opinion. In Inazuma, outside of A, the second person you'd probably consider to be the most powerful is Yae Miko. Yes, Ayato is a strong contender for the most powerful person in Inazuma politically, but Yae Miko is shown multiple times to have just as much influence, if not more. Yae Miko, as mean as she is, and as much as she is the kitsune trope, she's still a very powerful female character with a lot of agency. Like a lot of the other characters are terrified of her. We also have the more traditionally feminine characters who are strong in their own way, like Nilou. Nilou is a dancer. She's not the most confrontational, and while she's not a warrior or a fighter or someone who has any political influence, she is known to be very brave. She was ready to be arrested on the spot had Al-Haytham's plan failed. She had a lot of guts to do what she did in the Archon quest. She's also willing to partake in a debate against a scholar in her own story quest, knowing that she's not the most academic person to begin with. Again, that takes a lot of guts. Ayaka is probably the most traditionally feminine character in the game. She's soft-spoken, she's an actual noble woman, so she has the proper etiquette that you would expect from a lady. And despite all of my criticism of Ayaka's writing and execution, I have always appreciated that the trait that Hoyo has always highlighted about her is how hardworking she is, how she refused to back down, and how she did everything in her power to help her brother after their parents' passing. She was never some damsel in distress. She has moments of weaknesses, but she was never weak. So have I changed my mind about the state of female characters in Genshin? Well, yeah, I do think the writing of the female characters have improved significantly. There's just no denying that. And while there are still missed potentials that have yet to be redeemed, I'm personally excited to see what's in store for us in the future. I mean, all of the Fontaine characters have been handled pretty well up until this point, so I'm very excited to see how they will handle one of the most anticipated female characters in the game, especially since she's supposed to be morally ambiguous and borderline batshit crazy. So yeah, I'm really excited about that one. I think that's all that I have to say for now. I'm sorry if I didn't get to cover all of the female characters, especially a lot of the 4 stars, but I just don't want the runtime of this video to be too crazy. And again, all of this is just my opinion and based on my experiences in the fandom and how I viewed them in the story. You may think differently, you can have your own opinions. I don't hate any of the characters, quite the opposite actually. That's why I get so frustrated when I see missed potentials. And my next video will be about the state of male characters, which is long overdue. I have been meaning to make that one for a long time now, and it's only fair for me to analyze the male characters too, because a lot of the problems that plagues Genshin's writing is also applicable to the male characters. So stay tuned for that one if you're interested. Subscribe if you want. If not, that's okay too. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!